Whenever you see a mass shooting in America, I'm struck by the fact that there's a mental health army that descends into those suburban communities. But now we don't have the problem of mass shootings, but we have shootings that are spread out across 365 days. And I imagine that there's a similar level of trauma, if not greater, that develops as that occurs in the mass shooting context.
As a white woman, I know the impact it can have on a person for a society to take her pain seriously. When I survived sexual assault in my late teens, there were many, many programs that were available to support me. I didn't actually go to any of those programs. And at the same time, their very existence affected me profoundly. It communicated something. They told me that I mattered, that what happened to me was wrong, that I was deserving of care, that somehow what happened to me ran contrary to the values of my society in a way that was so important that society would invest resources in making sure that I came through it okay in some way. We have failed profoundly to make a comparable effort to provide young men of color who survive violence with the services and supports that they need and deserve, even though those young men are among the people most likely to survive harm in our country. We know that some people who are harmed and don't get well are more likely to go on to harm others. And that means that ending cycles of violence requires attending to all victims' pain, every time. And of course, these factors carry not only a human cost, but also a financial one. And it raises the question of whether we would rather help people heal or just pay the cost of their ongoing pain.
But even at a moment when you've got sort of the police-community relationship at the forefront, this political legislative opportunity to deal with mass incarceration, the failed war on drugs, which is great, and we're going to try and get something done in that regard. You know, this issue has still largely escaped notice, which is one of the reasons why I was so enthusiastic about the work that is being done with Danielle's leadership, in partnership with Ford and Vera and those on the panel, because I think that there's a real moment to inject the victimization issue of young men of color into it because it's been largely ignored.
We have began to go into the community. And so I've started a series of town hall meetings with my top executives and the key unit chiefs, 20 of us, right? Went to Brownsville last year and sat there in the school for hours and talked to the community about how we can work more closely together, going into the community and talking to people and explaining to them that we're not just here to lock them up, that our main duty is to do justice.
When we look at the criminal justice system, when we look at the issue of victimization, one of the issues that comes forward is the dehumanizing realities of our culture. One of the reasons that young black males don't get the attention that white women get as victims is that they're not part of the human narrative. We don't see them as human beings. We see them as criminals, we see them as thugs, we see them as animals. We have all kinds of names that we call them, rather than recognizing their humanity. And that contributes to black on black violence, because if the narrative is that young black males aren't human, young black males internalize that and devalue each other's lives. And so we need a real fresh way of thinking about the humanity of all people that are involved in the system, whether they're victims or whether they're perpetrators.
So part of that racial narrative is that young men of color are somehow immune to violence. And so that, I think it's pretty clear that everybody knows that they may be living in violent communities, right? I mean, the police are afraid to go in there. People don't want to go there at night. So it's not like there's a secret that these young men are exposed to violence. So the problem with the narrative is the notion that they're immune to it and it doesn't affect them in any particular sort of way. Hence, there's no need for a program or any sort of intervention. I'm reminded a couple decades ago when I was testifying in court about a young man who had been assaulted, and during the course of this assault, two other young men who were with him, one of them was killed. A very traumatic situation, developed really bad post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, the reason I saw him is that his parents brought him to see me because every time the incident came up, he would dissociate, he would be reliving it, he would scream, he'd run out of the house, thinking that it was all happening to him again. So I'm testifying about this in court, and in the middle of my testimony, the judge actually stopped me and said, you know, Dr. Dudley, are you trying to tell me that a kid from Bedford-Stuyvesant could be traumatized by this fight?
In relationship to healing, what are we doing basically to destigmatize like mental health services?
I mean, I think it's really going to require a meaningful, consistent community conversation and dialogue, because there's an expectation of resiliency when it comes to being the victim of a violent crime or an assault or an attempted robbery. That's just part of the inherent culture within the inner city.
In 2011, it was 685 cases with stop and frisk, mostly in Brooklyn. 685,000. 2012, 531,000. 2013, 191,000. Now, the vast majority of those folks stopped, were found to have done nothing wrong. No contraband, no guns, nothing. But they were left with bitterness. And when that bitterness doesn't dissipate in a day or two. And a few years ago, a black woman in her 60s who lived in Bed-Stuy was at an event, and she told me about how she was stopped. She went to her bodega in the middle of the day to get something, and she was stopped and told that it was a drug spot, and they searched her. Didn't find anything on her. But years later, she was still with tears in her eyes telling me this story. And when I went to barbershops when I was running to talk to young men to try to get them to support me, they gave me examples. And one barbershop owner said he got off work, he got food because he wanted to get home and see the Knicks game. He was stopped, and the officer threw his food down. Now, that doesn't represent all officers, but we cause damage when we do that, and people don't forget that. And so we have to do all we can to show that we respect the folks in the community.
And it is not only young men of color who express and internalize these messages. We all do. All of us are told that story every day. And like all the narratives we hear every day, we internalize those, and it can show up in our behavior, even as we hold righteous values and good beliefs. And so the process of uprooting this narrative, of beginning to tell different stories, of speaking out against it and replacing it with things that are true, is a project that involves all of us.